This is the question that was sent to me. I'm just reading it. It says here, we thought that you could speak about controversies within Krishna consciousness / ISKCON and how to deal with the views Shastras provide. The first thing that came to my mind is like perhaps issues surrounding gender or race or LGBT. At least usually the issues that disturb people are usually social ones and not philosophical ones. That's been my general observation of the younger generation of devotees. Of course, there might be other issues that are of a more philosophical nature, like the origins of the soul or the place of Raganuga Bhakti. These are some of the hot ones in the philosophical arena. But I get the sense that these controversies refers to of a more social nature. I could be corrected. A lot of the time we see that people get really disturbed by the seemingly, quote, hard statements the scriptures make. But we wanted to hear from you on how we can accept such views and not have them hinder our practices. Yes. So I got a few thoughts on this. My first thought is that the purpose of human life as viewed from a Vedanta tradition like ours is to investigate truth. With the distinction made between humans and animals is the ability to investigate. And so the opening statements of the Vedanta Sutra, for example, is Atato Brahma Jignasa. So now that you've attained, the word Atta means now, and now doesn't mean like just in this moment of time, but this moment in terms of the trajectory of the soul. Now that you have acquired a human life form, as opposed to other life forms, now is the time for Jignasa. Now is the time for investigation. And this is what distinguishes the human life form from the animal life form, is the ability to investigate, to inquire, ask questions, Jignasa. In fact, the opening principles of the Bhagavatam, as explored in the first 3 chapters of Srimad Bhagavatam, one of the important points that's brought up is that a human life lived well is one that is lived investigating the underlying reality of everything. Jivasya tattva jignasa narto yashcheha karma bihi. So human life is not meant for enjoying sense gratification, because that's available to the monkeys and the rabbits and the pigeons. They can all enjoy the same sense gratification that we enjoy. But one thing that they can't do that we can do is to investigate ultimate reality. So Jivasya Tattva Jignasa, the idea of a human life lived well is one that is lived investigating Tattva. The word Tattva generally just translates as truth, but it differs from like truth, Satya. Satya is another word in Sanskrit that is translated as truth as well. And the distinction between the two words is that Satya kind of refers to a person who's like truthful through and through. Their words and their thoughts and their actions are all matching. Hey guys, can you keep it down? Their words and their actions are all matching. So they're like a truthful person. Whereas the word tattva refers to like a reality that can be demonstrated. Like if you use the proper tools, you can demonstrate that this is an actually objective reality that can be understood by all. This is the sense of the word tattva. So human life lived well is meant for investigating the tattva, those realities that can be demonstrated to others also, and of course to ourselves. This is narto yashcheha karma bihi, and nothing else should be the purpose of your work as a human being. In other words, you may be working to like pay bills and so on, but that's not the real purpose of your work. That part is just for keeping your body and soul together, but the real work is to investigate tattva. So I think when it comes to dealing with controversial topics, the first point is how much are we interested in investigating the truth of a subject matter. For example, I gave one of the issues that tends to be brought up as problematic, like a race issue. Prabhupada said things about certain races. I'm Black people. He said some really interesting things, which I find kind of funny. He says things about women that can be viewed as very controversial today. He said things. Prabhupada has said things about LGBT, which will be viewed as problematic in the social landscape. How might one deal with these controversies? Well, the first thing is, how much are you interested in the truth that's being explained when these controversies are brought up? Unless you're interested in the actual tattva of it, the truth that is being explained, then you'll not be able to resolve controversies either externally or within your own heart. And the biggest enemy to the investigation of tattva, so this is still within the first point, but the biggest enemy in the investigation of tattva is, well, I have here in my notes, the way I like to articulate it is credulity. The word credulity or credulous means you kind of just accept that the way you think, or that the world that you're seeing is, the truth. That's the truth of the matter. That's what it is. I saw a movie about a few weeks ago with, for the first time, The Truman Show. I don't know how many of you have seen that. Really cool movie. The protagonist is Jim Carrey. And anyway, if you know the show, The Truman Show, the movie, I don't want to go through the whole detail. It's going to eat up a lot of my time. But basically, he's a corporate. He was purchased by a corporation, and they built this whole show around him, but he doesn't know that there's a show built up around his life. So later on in the movie, he starts to discover some anomalies, and he starts to discover that he might be living in a movie set that he hitherto thought was his actual life. And so he begins asking questions, and that inquiry spirit begins to remove the veil of what was actually going on. At one point, as he was starting to discover the roots of it all, the creator of the show, some corporate guy, he was asked by a reporter, how come it's taken Truman this long to figure out that this is a ruse? And he says a statement which I thought was interesting and profound. And he says, generally, we accept the world that's presented to us. And we kind of just take it for granted that the world that's presented to our eyes is the truth. And I thought that was a very profound statement in this context. So in other words, we're credulous. We take for granted that whatever is presented to my eyes, whatever I've learned in school or in Krishna consciousness, even for that matter, we take it for granted that it's the truth. Now, of course, you can believe in something that's true, but it's not true because you believe it. And certainly a truth that you've come to because of investigating it for yourself is a more substantial understanding of the truth than a truth that is just received and kind of downloaded, so to speak, into our psyche through our culture and through our mediums of education and so on. So so this is the biggest obstacle that I personally find when people are trying to understand a controversy, is that they're very credulous, and what I want to zoom in on here quickly is we take for granted that our way of thinking about the world is the truth, even if we've not deeply investigated the nature or sources of our belief. We just take it for granted that that's the truth. Krishna speaks about this in Geeta in several places, but for example, chapter 7, verse 27, Itra Dvesha Samutvaina, Vanda Mohena Bharata, Sarvabhutani Samoham Sargayanti Parantapa. So Krishna says in the Gita that all souls are born into complete delusion. That delusion is of the nature of duality, and they're deluded by the imprints of desire and hate. Itra Dvesha Samutena means the imprints of desire and hate. So in other words, in our past life, we lived in a certain way. We became habituated in a certain way. We had certain things that we liked and certain things that we didn't like. That was maintained in our psyche. And then we have this life, and those attachments and aversions immediately arise, and we operate or function in the world according to those desires and hates. And we kind of take it for granted that what we like or what we don't like is the truth. Of course, when you're speaking in a philosophical context, you may be able to accept that, yeah, you can analyze and say this isn't the truth. But generally, as we live on a very visceral level, we accept that our way of feeling, our way of thinking about the world, it must be the truth. That's how we just act in a sort of natural way, even if those truths are not really investigated or challenged, which is kind of a part of the work of researching the ultimate reality of something, is you have to be challenged. So what happens when we're afflicted, well, when this obstacle of prejudice is blocking us from investigating the truth in its own right, what comes up is when you hear the opposite perspective of things, something that challenges your way of thinking and feeling and knowing, really. Even if it's a way of thinking, feeling that you've never really investigated up until being challenged. What I've observed is when someone is challenged about it, then they become incredulous. Now, the incredulity is not necessarily based on the falsity of the challenge that's coming to them, but it's based on the fact that it's not congruent with their own way of thinking. I hope I'm making sense. In other words, for example, taking the same example, you may hear from Prabhupada's books or in Vedic culture that they had a little bit of racism. They did not believe that all cultures were equal. Far from it. They didn't believe that people were equal. So we grow up in an egalitarian landscape like the one we grew up in. And we take it for granted. No, all men are created equal. That's kind of something that was not maybe deeply thought about or analyzed, but it's kind of been a core value that was received and downloaded into our psyches through our culture and education. And so when you hear something like all men are created equal, this race is not, as good as this race in this particular area, now you become incredulous. Now the incredulity is not necessarily based on the falsity of the assertion being made, but it's just based on the fact that it's not current with our own way of thinking. And these things, for the person who's investigating truth, these things are actually welcomed. It's like actually a welcome challenge that, wow, I've never thought about this deeply. Of course, you can, well, what usually follows incredulity is, how do you say it? Like character assassination, slander. The reason he thinks like this is because he's a racist or he's evil or ... Before we jump to conclusions like that, for a thoughtful person who's really investigating the truth of something, they may first want to ascertain, well, what are the reasons that a person has come to that particular conclusion, if there are viable reasons? And are those reasons valid, or in what sense are they valid? And how is my own way of thinking about the situation hitherto unchallenged in my own life or uninvestigated in my own life? How is this new information that's coming to light going to help me to refine my understanding of what the ultimate reality of something is? So this is kind of the first point. You have to really be interested in the truth and not just interested in having your own way of thinking confirmed. Again, we can believe something that's true, but it's not true just because we believe it. So there has to be the spirit of investigation. And this is the unique opportunity that the human form of life provides, is that we can investigate things. And so one who does not use that potential of human life and rather suffers from credulity, the problem of my prejudice being how I understand the world, and that's true, which is no different than an animal, then you'll not be able to resolve controversies either for yourself or for others. A couple other points here, because I don't want to go on too long. After you become interested in actually investigating the truth, and that itself can be a whole process, getting to that genuine interest. I really want to understand the truth of something, because frankly speaking, there are so many things to know in this world. So how much time do you have to investigate every little topic? And you will discover that even a topic that seems like this should be like easy to defeat, or it should be taken for granted, like this is true, you'll find that a lot of topics aren't really that easy to draw conclusions from once you start actually investigating them. So the whole process of choosing what type of truths you want to involve yourself with, that's a whole thing. And after you've come to that conclusion, I need to investigate this. Then the other thing that's really important for resolving controversies is understanding the means that are taken to arrive at the truths that we arrive to. This is called as Pramana in Sanskrit. You'll see this word in Geeta in several places. For example, chapter 3:21, famous verse. Yad acharati shreshtas tatarivo torojana. So yat pramanam kurute lokasa anuvartate. Krishna says here, telling Arjuna, whatever the best man does, the common man follow, accepting that as the pramana for what they should be doing. And indeed, you see the best man in the modern world is like Cardi B and Beyonce and all, these people that devotees we would consider more or less in the category of fools and rascals. They're taken as the example of how they should even think about all, even political issues. They may not be into politics, but if they make some comment about political issues, they have influence over their millions of followers and so on. So because it's natural that whatever the best guy is doing, Acharya Shreshta, Sayat Pramana, then that is taken as evidence which should be done for everyone. Another place where this word Pramana comes in the Geeta is chapter 16, verse 24. Tasmat Shastram Pramanam Te. Krishna is saying, Cardia, Acharya, Bossy, to allow the scripture to be the Pramana, the evidence for what you should and should not do. And this way you can make progress. So once you become interested in investigating truth, then the first thing you stumble upon is understanding what are the sources of evidence or your means of coming to a particular truth or someone else's means of arriving at a certain truth. Just as a FYI, the word prama in Sanskrit means like right knowledge or truth. And the word pramata refers to a person who knows the truth. And the word pramana means the means that such a person used to arrive at that truth. So pramana, if your pramana is compromised in any way, then obviously the truth that you know through that pramana must also necessarily be compromised. And therefore, anyone who's interested in understanding the truth of something, they have to understand what are the pramanams that are being used and accepted to come to certain conclusions about certain, truths or reality. You've heard this before, but there's about 10 Pramanas that's accepted in Vedanta, but out of the 10, 3 of them are prominent. Direct sensual perception of something, that is called as Pratyaksha Pramana, that which you can directly experience with your senses. And then there's logical deduction. This is called Anuman Pramana. This, of course, logic depends on a known category that is experienced or heard about, and an unknown category that you're trying to logically deduce, and a connecting point that allows you to connect the known to the unknown category. Anyway, it's all pretty technical, but logical deduction you can understand. Anuman Pramana. And then the last category of means is Shabda Pramana. Shabda Pramana means language, basically, the evidence that comes from language. Hearing from someone who is a trustworthy source, called as an Apta-Purusha, a trustworthy source and a trustworthy, not only trustworthy source, but a trustworthy authority in the particular field that you're trying to gain understanding. If you look at your day-to-day life, most of the things that we claim to know comes from this third category of pramana, Shabda Pramana. So all of us are not scientists, so we depend on scientists' testimony to present the truth about, let's say, COVID, for example. You depend on, if you're not a physicist or an astronomer, then you depend on the testimony of a physicist to give you information about the universe outside of what we can see and so on. So you'll discover that a lot of the things that we claim to know or be confident about are depending on this last pramana, Shabda, hearing from authorities. Krishna consciousness. We hear about a spiritual world that we've never seen, a Krishna that we may not have directly perceived, and so on. So that depends on the Shabda Pramana, some authority giving information. And of course, again, Tasma Shastram Pramanam Te. Of course, in Vedanta, we take the scripture as a Shabda for especially things that are transphenomenal, things that are transcendent. But even for things in this world, the scriptures take it as Pramanam. Otherwise, people take other authorities in this world as the language that they depend on for understanding different subject matters. In any case, in order to understand the truth of something, you have to really explore Pramana deeply. Like I find it interesting, to be honest with you, like with this COVID situation, there's been devotees who are kind of on the conspiracy side of things and their understanding of what's going on. And then there's devotees who accept the more mainstream narrative of things. And these devotees are kind of, at least I've been seeing, I don't know if you've been seeing, I've been seeing devotees like fight on Facebook or even in real life over what's the truth of the matter. And what I find interesting about a lot of these fights is that what I find, because I'm a dork, what I find fascinating is the Pramanams that are being used. You know, sometimes people just pull up Pramanams that confirm their own particular, again, their own prejudice, which to me speaks to a lack of interest in the truth of the matter, but rather just in being right, which doesn't help you actually resolve any controversy for yourself or others. And I see that happening on both sides. So, and then oftentimes when people present other Pramanas counteracting a certain belief or narrative, then again, that incredulity problem comes up that I already mentioned. Like, how could you believe such nonsense? And both parties are saying that to each other. I just find it very interesting. In any case, on a personal level, if you're actually interested in understanding the truth of something, especially a controversial point, you have to really investigate the Pramanas that are being used. And your inquiry will protect you from being deceived. But if you're not deeply inquisitive about a subject matter, you just want to be right, then you're not going to be able to resolve it. I have a few other points, but it's already 7:22. I just have a couple other ideas that I thought could be meaningful to the conversation. Maybe I'll just mention them in just a couple of minutes and then open it up for any sort of conversation in this regard. I've obviously haven't mentioned any specific controversial situations, so we can bring up controversies and then kind of take these tools that I'm giving suggestion to and maybe explore a particular controversy if you like. But I'm more giving like a tool by which you might be able to navigate a controversy with dispassion and equipoise. Just a couple other ideas here is that I think are important in this conversation. This is a word you're probably familiar with, this paradigm. So another reason why it's hard to reconcile controversies amongst people today is that oftentimes they're working from two different paradigms. And they're trying to understand one paradigm from the context of their own paradigm, which makes it somewhat impossible to understand and therefore engage with in an intellectually honest way. For example, when you look at, let's say, scriptural assertion about women and the social order, we often tend to look at those statements from the paradigm of how we think of proper social structures today. And so obviously when looking at such statements in the scripture from that paradigm, you don't get a clarity of understanding of why those edicts were in place. Why were women in this particular position? Why were, Shudras in this particular position? And in order to engage with it intelligibly and honestly, you have to really understand where someone's coming from first. Maybe where someone's coming from in terms of culture or where their premises. What is the paradigm that they're working in that is drawing them to certain conclusions? Only then, after understanding the context, will you be able to engage with it in an honest way. Otherwise, it's just, us lambasting them for not fitting our particular standards of what we think a proper structure is. In other words, they're not conforming to our paradigm. And what I find interesting is that this not conforming to someone's paradigm in one context will be deemed as beautiful, and in another context is deemed as controversial, which is interesting. Like, for example, you have things like cultural appropriation, which is a hot topic. Well, it was at least at one point in our social arena. And if someone, or maybe not cultural appropriation, I'm thinking like cultural conformity. I don't know if there's a better word for this, but like when Europeans, for example, came over to, like, let's say India or other parts of the world, the Americas, and they were expecting people to conform to their own particular culture, like forcing their paradigm on another culture, that's considered like evil on the one hand. But then you have like modern America, that if you don't accept like a mainstream narrative that is mostly properly accepted by everyone, then your not conforming is a problem. So anyway, I'm just showing you different angles how that kind of fascinates me. In both cases, there's usually the tendency not to consider the different paradigms first and to see where people are coming from and then try to engage with it. So my last point, if you're equipped with this, the desire for investigation of the truth and not just having your biases confirmed, you are understanding the subject matter of Pramana and how that affects your investigation in truth. You're taking into consideration paradigms in order to get a clarity of understanding what's actually being said. Then the last point that I have here in my notes is engaging what's called the Purva Paksha. So the word Purva means previous, and the Paksha means view, the previous view. In other words, when you have to establish the reality that you understand as the conclusive understanding, then you have to engage with the Purva Paksha. What is the previous view? And you have to show the defects of the previous view after first understanding it. That was why I brought up the paradigm point first. After first understanding it, then you show the defects of the previous view and how your conclusion answers those defects and presents a more holistic understanding of what's actually going on. So this is called the Purva Paksha, engagement with the Purva Paksha. If you study the works of our Acharyas, you'll discover that when they're writing their commentaries, they always write their commentaries like this. You know, so-and-so may say ... Then they present some doubt to the premise that they're bringing up. So in other words, our acharyas are bringing up a premise that the Bhagavatam is saying, and then they're showing previous schools of thought's objection to the premise. So then what the acharyas are demonstrating is that they know what these other positions are very well. And then after presenting in an honest way what the Purva Paksha is, a previous view, then they go on to defeat that view. We say like that at least. They go on to defeat that view to show that this Siddhanta, this conclusion that we're presenting is more holistic and it settles the defects of the previous view and so on. So in this way, it's like a whole process if you really want to resolve a controversy within your heart and for others also. What ends up happening is that most of us we don't have any of these qualifications. We're not interested in the truth, or at least we're not super active in investigating it, more or less satisfied with our credulity or incredulity, depending on who we're talking to. We don't investigate how people have come to their conclusions, what pramanams they're being used. That is usually not done. People often do not take into considerations different paradigms, and they don't deal with the Purva Paksha. Or if they do, they kind of straw man, give like the weakest argument to something so they can smash it and show that they're superior. So in this way, controversy will continue. There's a couple of nice verses from the Bhagavatam about why controversies exist and continue to this day. But I've already spoken quite a bit, and if you like, we can see those verses. Otherwise, I'd like to stop here, and I think I've said I have a lot more to say, really, to be honest with you, but I don't want to bore you any longer. You've already tolerated quite enough. So that's what I got. That's what I have on this particular subject matter. Again, I didn't explore any particular controversy, but if you want to do that now in the question and answers, I'm happy to discuss any sort of controversial situation.
Thank you so much again for that introduction talk to it. There are a couple questions that came in, and there are a couple of people in the chat, like private messaging, asking if they could get those set of verses that you're referring to.
That I mentioned at the end just now?
Yeah, from the Bhagavatam, like the ones that refer to the controversy and like why it happens.
Yes, the first one is 6th Canto, chapter 4, verse 31. And the second one is 11th Canto, chapter 22. I would have to actually look this one up. Dude, my phone is jacked up, dude. iPhone 7 is ridiculous. And I can give you plenty of pramana for that, like pratyaksha, direct perception. Dude, this stupid phone. Anyway, I'm gonna look up the other one. We can bring up the other questions if you like.
Sure. In the meantime, I'll read the first question that came in. So this is an anonymous question. And the question is, I'm afraid that if I come out as LGBT/not straight in my temple community, I will not be accepted. I know my family will accept me, but I'm afraid that people in my congregation will reject me, or even my family, as it is a very conservative community. Could you please give me some advice on how to deal with this? Thank you, and Hare Krishna.
Well, I have a couple videos on, well, first of all, I did a podcast with Nam Ross on this subject matter about, what was it, 2 years ago now? A year ago? A year ago, I think it was a year ago. A little bit more than a year ago, maybe a half. You can check that out. I'll have to find a link on that. I have also a couple of Instagram videos that I did on this. I would have to find them, and I can send them to Yash and he can send them to you. Yeah, I think this sort of thing about LGBT or just kind of being comfortable in your own skin, this relates to that other word I brought up in the beginning of the class, satya. The word satya meaning truth in another way, where there's authenticity or congruence with your words, your actions, and your speech. And the basic devotee, because he is situated in satya, he is called a sitam. One who is the truthful devotee is often translated by Prabhupada. So obviously, to be fully situated in truth for Vedanta is to be situated in your soul and operating from the position of your soul. That is the real truthfulness. But I understand, at least on our way to that level of truthfulness, there's a certain conventional truthfulness that has to be there also in order for us to live truthfully also as devotees. And that's kind of accepting the sort of the cards that you've been dealt, so to speak. And yeah, being authentic through and through to, accepting that these are the cards I've been dealt and I have to live with that. And I have to, whatever I'm meant to learn from this sort of karma, I have to accept for my education. But there's really no sense of hiding it, or, of course, it gets tricky because you're mentioning that I live in a conservative community. So you have to, there's, how important is this community for you? Are there other communities that are more, let's say, more accepting or more understanding of more essential, like they can see the essential topics like Krishna consciousness and these peripheral things like sexuality is not really a big issue? Are there communities out there that you can flourish in without needing to hide? I guess the general thing I want to say is that if you're in a position where you aren't able to practice truthfulness, even on a conventional level, not only is it not sustainable, but it will adversely impact your ability to practice Christian consciousness. I personally seen a lot of devotees, particularly LGBT devotees, leave Christian consciousness straight up because of finding it too oppressive at the end of the day to not, as they like to say in the modern world, live their truth. In other words, not able to practice a sort of a conventional truthfulness and just being authentic to what sort of cards they've been dealt with in this life. So I think that's something that's obviously in your life journey. That's something you're going to have to work out. Finding like how important is this particular community to you. At the end of the day, even if the community is important to you, will you be able to flourish if you're not able to live authentically? Now, having said that, as a person who also is part of the LGBT community is wild. And so we don't want to, I guess I want to say that part of being authentic is being really true to your principles. Something like sexuality is just the cards that we've been dealt. But after being dealt a certain hand, it's what you do with that hand that really counts, like in poker. This analogy of cards has been used in the sixth canto. That's why I'm using it. Vitrusura, he was dealt a pretty heavy hand, taking birth as a demon. That's not, totally. And of course, people of a super conservative community might consider LGBT birth also demonic birth as well. I've gotten that a few times. And I used to wear it proudly. I never used to even feel offended by that or anything like that. So you can have demonic birth and be a profound devotee, as Vitrusura was. But he kind of had an acceptance of the cards that he was dealt, and then he worked with that. He worked within that to develop, you can say, his bhakti. So in the same way, to be really truthful is not just like being true to your sexuality. That's really minor and in some ways insignificant. Although it is a particular milestone to cross, especially if you're younger and you're not trying to figure who you are and trying to, discover, come to a place of self-acceptance and all that. But the real truthfulness is, what are your principles in life? Like, what type of principles do you want to live by? And you have to ultimately be true to that. And if some community isn't able to accept you because of this minor factor, despite your willingness to live according to like certain principles, then that might not be the community for you. There are other communities that are super loving and can see the essence without getting caught up on peripheral things. So that wasn't the most organized answer as I would have liked it to be, but that's I'm gonna start with that. I did the best I could. You can send the videos. You can send the videos and.
Yeah, I put the video in the chat.
Okay,
for anyone who's asking, the YouTube link is the podcast that Jaya Jagannath did on similar topic. Okay, so we actually have more questions. The next question is, some of my friends who grew up in a devotee family are now starting to pursue an atheistic lifestyle. They have questioned me, and hence I am asking this question. How do we know if any of this is real? And this is referring to Krishna consciousness, this whole culture of ISKCON, etc.
Yeah, that's the journey that you have to take for yourself. And that was kind of my first point, Tata Jignasa. You have to investigate. The word Tata means, again, underlying reality. So I can ask the atheist question, an interesting question. How do you know this is a real world outside of your mind? Because there's actually no empirical way of proving that. Because if you say something like, well, this is a cup, well, that's a circular reasoning, because you're assuming in the beginning what you're trying to prove in the end. So you're assuming this is real in the beginning, but I'm asking you if it's real. So it's a sort of circular logic. It's a very interesting question. I think it's one of those fun questions. How do you know this is a real world outside of your mind? When you're dreaming, you often experience a dream world is very real, and you accept it as such until you wake up. So how do you know the world that we're experiencing now is a real world outside of your mind? There's no way to empirically demonstrate that. Someone may say, well, there was a paper from yesterday that could have been written today. So in this way, you have all these kind of what they call like, well, I can't use bad language here, but these mind screws. Obviously, this is the journey that every individual has to take for themselves. And that was my first point. Tattva Jignasa. This is what the human form of life is meant for. The discovery of what is ultimate reality. One thing that I appreciate about the older philosophical world versus the modern world is that I feel like in the old world, people like really put their money where their mouth is. Like they thought something was true, like existentialists, for example. They thought something was true and they just like lived it. Even though it was like completely miserable and completely depressing conclusions, they were like, this is the truth. And you got a sense that they were like really interested in finding out what the truth of something was. Whereas in the modern world, you get a sense that they're just more about like arguing and getting some Twitter, some social media, some social media like credit. So this is a journey that every individual has to take for themselves. Now, if you're asking me, how do I know Krishna Conscious role? Well, I have my Pramanas, right? Because as I mentioned, when you're investigating the truth of something, then the next question comes is, what are your Pramanas by which you arrive to that conclusion, right? Someone may say, I accept this world as real because of pratyaksha. I can see it, I can experience it with my senses, therefore it's real. So that's the Pramana that they used. So if someone's claiming the existence of a transcendence, then what is the Pramana that they use to get to that? So of course, if you're asking me, my Pramana, of course, is Srimad Bhagavatam. And within that Pramana, they give a process called Bhakti Yoga, which you have to follow, which you have to purify your subtle body from and so on. And in other words, realization there's an existential qualification for realizing more transcendent truths. In the same way that someone takes psychedelics and their mind is open up to a reality that would have, up until that point, maybe been denied because of not having the capacity with their ordinary central perception. So in the same way, bhakti is like a psychedelic. Anyway, don't quote me on that. But bhakti is like a psychedelic that opens the mind up to a transcendent world. Well, how do you know that? Well, I have the Pramana of Srimad Bhagavatam. I have the testimony of other saints. Well, someone said, well, that's not enough. Okay, well, I can ask you so many questions too and show you that there's so many things that you accept in the testimony of those who are purported to be authorities today. Like, for example, here's a doozy. How do you know the Earth is a globe? Flat Earth has been a huge movement that's been growing since 2015. It seems crazy, but how do you know? Now, if you have to ask that question for yourself, then the answer is, well, that's what I learned in school. And we have pictures. Well, how do you know those pictures are real? Well, because these authorities, NASA, they have presented them. And why would they have any reason to cheat us? I can think of $19 billion reasons why. But anyway, why would they have any reason to cheat us? So naturally, you're accepting a conclusion based on testimony. So in the same way, theists, they accept certain conclusions based on testimonies of authorities like Narada Muni, Vyasadeva, Srila Prabhupada, and of course, Srimad Bhagavatam. So that's if you're asking me. But my answer to the question is the first part, that this is a journey that everyone has to take as an individual. I know devotees who are born in the movement, they realize that they have to join the movement too. You know, I joined the movement when I was 18, and then I would see all these kids like, oh, how wonderful. You know, they grew up in Krishna Conscious from the very beginning. But as I was sticking around for a little bit longer and I was observing, I was like, oh, these cats haven't joined either. They all floating over there in the sense gratification world, thinking all sorts of nonsense that they learned in school and everything. So everyone has to take the journey of truth discovery for themselves. You know, obviously this individual who has come to an atheistic conclusions, they must have their reasons for doing that. I might, if I were to ask their process, such as investigating their Pramanas and their motivations, I might be able to point out some defects in their process by which they come to that conclusion. But anyway, I won't be able to do that. Obviously, I don't know the individual. So my answer to this question, this is a journey that everyone has to take. Yeah, how do you know what you know? Well, you have to investigate it for yourself. You have to research those Pramanas and you have to apply and see. I don't know what better answer I can give than this.
Perfect. There's actually a follow-up to it. And like you mentioned, like since it is like an individual journey and you have to figure out what that is, the question is, what is a good first step to find one's own pramana and faith?
A good first step for finding one's own pramana and faith? Well, that will depend on the strength of your question. That's why this inquiry thing cannot be underestimated. Yeah, underestimated. That's a word, right? You know how sometimes you say words and it just sounds weird? Like I remember one time saying the word put. I couldn't figure out how to spell put. Me too. And I was like, how do you spell put? And I was like, P-O-O-T. I was like, no, that ain't right. And then I had to ask someone, I'm like, how do you spell put? And anyway, so sorry about that. So the importance of the question cannot be underestimated. Prabhupada has this wonderful purport in 125 Srimad Bhagavatam, where he mentions how the whole world is filled with questions and answers. The birds and beasts, when they wake up in the morning, they have questions and answers. When the lawyer wakes up in the morning, he has questions and answers. All of us are always asking questions and answers throughout our day even. How are you? How are you holding up during COVID? How was the last season of, Game of Thrones? How is this new movie? So many questions are coming. And according to the question, you get a certain type of knowledge. I have this maxim that I like to use a lot. The evolution of inquiry precedes the evolution of being. I use this maxim a lot because I think it's very true. Our questions have to deepen. And according to the question, a certain knowledge, if you will, is revealed to you. A knowledge that answers those questions. And what's interesting, in answering certain questions, new questions are revealed. And that way your inquiry keeps deepening. It requires constant engagement with new knowledge or new revelation within a certain knowledge structure. So how to know which pramana is going to work or will be best, that depends on the strength of your question. What type of questions you're asking and where are you finding answers to those questions? Are you finding answers from your sensual experience? Are you finding answers from the wisdom of scriptures? So you will decide what is the best pramana. But your ability to decide will depend on the strength of your question. What type of question you're asking and how your question is evolving. So that depends on you. That's all I can say to that.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. So the next question is, where does uncertainty play a role into dealing with controversy? Are we allowed to accept sometimes that things are complicated and not everything is black and white?
Yes, of course. I think for the people who are more intellectually honest, they'll be able to admit uncertainty. In other words, people, if we are a little bit thoughtful, a little bit introspective, then we know for sure that we suffer from this incredulity problem. Like with certain things, we're like super credulous. We're like, yeah, that's the truth, man. I think they call them echo chambers now in the modern lingo. And then with certain other ideas, we're just completely incredulous, even if we know nothing about it. You know, I remember mentioning to some friends that I was interested in flat Earth because the Pramana seemed to present some sort of like flat Earth model. So I remember when I mentioned, my friends just started dogging me, and like in jest, you know, in good friendship, they were making fun of me. So then I was like, why the incredulity? So I started grilling them, asking some questions from the things that I was researching. And it wasn't like they could present a very compelling case for their particular conviction. You know, other than, yeah, that's what I learned in school. That's what I heard from this and that. That's what I saw some pictures. I was like, yeah, that sounds like really solid investigation that you've done there. So we all suffer from this incredulity issue. And by being a little introspective, when we're dealing with a subject matter that's not familiar to us, or either it's not familiar, or we've never engaged with it in a very intellectual way. Like, again, taking this topic, all men are not created equal. We've always just assumed that they're created equal. So if someone comes out and says that, we've never really engaged with that question before. And so instead of just like, what are you talking about? It's like, wait a minute. Okay, where are you coming from? Why do you say that? That's just like really blowing my mind that you would even say that in this modern culture. And then they give X, Y, Z reasons. And then you say, you know what, I have to sit with that. I'm not sure about that. It takes obviously a very intellectually honest person. It also takes a person who's dispassionate and a person who's a little bit like, what's the word? Equipoise, or kind of like neutral. And like, yeah, you know what? I don't know about that. I have to say, you know, I'm not inclined to believe that because I know I have a certain way I think about the subject matter. But these are some new points brought to mind, some new information. I never considered it before. My experience is that most of us are not like that. The combination of being dispassionate, being intellectually honest when you just haven't really engaged with something. Many times when I'm getting into a heated sort of debate, especially like on Facebook, one of my favorite questions to ask people is that, what's your Pramana? That's usually my very first question, because I know for the most part, no one's investigated anything. So how do you know that? Like someone says, well, because this is, I'm like, how do you know that? And then I said, well, because, you know, it was this article, and I was like, did you read it? Did you actually read it? And you know, if they do like that's pause, you know, it was like that awkward pause. And they're like, yeah. Like, nah, buddy, you paused for 1.5 seconds. You lying. So, in other words, it's rare to find someone who has that, literally that level of sattva guna, the mode of goodness, to be kind of like dispassionate, introspective, and like, okay, yeah, I haven't engaged with that. Intellectually honest. So obviously, uncertainty is going to be there for the vast majority of subject matters because, like I said, there's so much knowledge. How much time do we have to engage with all of it? We really don't. I saw a nice quote from George Orwell about a week ago, where he says that even the greatest expert in a particular field immediately becomes an ignoramus when he steps outside of that field. And I thought it was just like a brilliant statement speaking to the large category of knowledge that will be actually in the uncertain category. So there's obviously only so many things we want to be certain about. And of course, if we're devotees, we want to be certain about Krishna. So a lot of our time's going to go there. So that's my attempt at that particular question.
Thanks, Pedro. Okay, so this one's a little bit longer. But the question is, sometimes I wonder if, had I been born in another faith group, I would have the same amount of conviction in the faith that I do now in Krishna consciousness. Since I was born
which may not be a deep conviction. So I'm just put that out there right now. Okay, continue.
Since I was born in this tradition, I have been taught that this is the bona fide truth and everything else is illusion.
Yeah.
As a result, it feels like my faith is as a result of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
You mentioned paradigms at the beginning of the seminar. If we all have different paradigms and context to understand the truth, isn't truth subjective? And is there a surefire way to tell what is truth and what is Maya?
Yes. So I'm gonna add the last question first. Is there a surefire way to tell something is true? Well, if you were asking the Vedanta culture, the answer is yes, when you directly seeing it. If you're directly seeing Krishna, in other words, then you know for a fact that it's true. You can see, for example, First Canto, Chapter 2, verse number 21, that Pashyanti Atmani Drishyate, when the truth is seen directly, then you know for a fact it is true. But until then, it is just like a subjective reality existing in your own mind. So that is definitely a dilemma for the sadhaka. In other words, we, just speaking to the point of this question, I grew up in this tradition, someone grew up in another tradition, so we accept that thing is true. But unless and until you're actually having communion with divinity in a very, like a visceral way, what we call is prema, bhava and prema in Krishna consciousness, then there will always be some doubt. Is this the reality? In fact, again, go and see this verse, 1-21, Srimad Bhagavatam. It says, Vidite hidaya grantis, chindanti, I don't remember the rest of the verse. This verse is saying that when the hard knot of ego is cut, chindanti, something samshaya, and all doubts have been cut to pieces. Then, and one sees the truth within himself, and at that time you've attained, Krishna consciousness. Anyway, that was a very poorly translated of that verse, 1-21. But the idea here is that so Jiva Goswami, if you see the commentary to this verse, he mentions 3 types of doubts. And one of the doubts that comes is the ultimate existence of that reality that is being purported to be true, the transcendence. So that doubt can only be countered by actually directly communing with God. Until then, you have your faith that comes from whatever the Pramanas that you're using. And also like I said, the most important of the Pramanas is Shabda Praman. And Shabda Praman largely depends on trustworthy authorities. So most persons will take that as, at least the truth that's leading them to the direction of actually directly perceiving it. Okay, so having said that, I want to problematize this point that I grew up in Krishna consciousness, so I know it's true. Someone grew up in another faith, they know it's true. So that was exactly what I was trying to speak to in the beginning of this presentation. That a lot of things that we grow up with, whether they be scientific truths or they're spiritual truths, they were downloaded into our psyche before we had the ability to think critically about them. And a large portion of our life is directed by that psyche that was basically formulated by someone else, not by my deep shaping of my own mind or mental world. So I personally feel that faith, I have credence for this in scripture also. You have to challenge your faith or have someone else challenge it for you if you can't think of it. Like, I think like Krishna consciousness is perfect, so I can't think of any defect. But I meet a lot of people who challenge. And then I was like, you know what? I never thought about that. Let me get back to you. I remember when I first joined Krishna consciousness, I was 18, 19, and I was going to the DePaul University, and I was literally going there just to argue with the students. I didn't give a damn about distributing books. Like, that was just like if a book got distributed, that was great. But I went there to argue with the students, and they like to argue with me too. So it was great, all that young, passionate energy. And sometimes I would walk away from an argument not being able to like defeat them or crush them, demoralize them. That was really the goal. And not being able to demoralize them, I felt demoralized. So I would go back to the temple and I would study up to try to understand, like, actually that question they brought up or that argument they made was actually really good. I don't know how to answer that. And in that way, I was, because I couldn't think of anything wrong with Krishna consciousness for myself, my faith got challenged by someone else that allowed me to investigate deeper. Of course, all persons go through this process, and they may still arrive to the conclusion of their particular scripture, which is a whole fascinating thing in and of itself. So this is going on in the material world, but the only way you can really know if you're beyond Maya is when you're beyond Maya and directly perceiving that reality, communing with it. And of course, we have symptoms of the self-realized persons that are mentioned in scripture, which I think is unique to Indian orthodoxy in general, that they speak of the qualities of liberated persons, which you don't find so much in other traditions. And it gives us a hint of what it means to be free from the influence of Maya, so you can maybe make out for yourself if that is the case. Yeah, this is the best I can do with it. You know, all these questions in themselves could probably be seminars, to be real, but we only have so much time to.
I like the thorough answers. It really helps. So, Bakunda, I think you had a question. Do you want to just unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah. Hare Krishna.
Hey.
Sometimes we are encouraged when reading Prabhupada's books to take his statements at face value, take them literally. And sometimes we see that devotees interpret the statement to, you know, especially if it's something that's hard to grapple with, like women are less intelligent. And then someone says, okay, so what Prabhupada means here is blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, and there's a lot of statements like that, right? And so sometimes people say, accept it as it is. Sometimes people interpret it. How are we supposed to know which is to be done when?
Yeah, I would go, again, going back to the tools that I brought up, Tattva Jignasa, Pramana, and Paradigm, and Purvapaksha. A statement like women are less intelligent, for example, that's the example you gave. That requires context in order to understand. There's a cultural context, the cultural context of Varnashram, for example, and the role of women in such a culture. You know, for example, traditionally in Varnashram culture, women did not receive the same education as men. Their education was largely concerned with how to be a mother and how to be a wife. That was kind of the training. If you read about Sri Dharma in Srimad Bhagavatam, Sri Dharma just means that the wife follows the vows of the husband. That's her main dharma. And so that meant that the education of a woman was geared accordingly. So they were like practically less intelligent in a certain way, in a certain sense, because they didn't get the same training. And Prabhupada's movement, you may be knowing that one time, I think Gaurangi, she was one of Prabhupada's early disciples. So Prabhupada first gave second initiation to the guys. He didn't give to the girls. So Gaurangi, she protested, why are you not giving to the girls? And Prabhupada, he made some mention to how men and women have different education. So men get this. And she said, but Prabhupada, here in the States, the women get the same education. And Prabhupada was like, all right. Then he gave. At least that's how Gaurangi tells the story in Prabhupada Memories. That's how she tells it, from what I recall. So Prabhupada was like, okay, yeah, y'all got the same education. So, you know, you also get Brahman initiation. Anyway, that's a very sweet Prabhupada story, this sort of flexibility that Prabhupada had on a personal level. But when Prabhupada makes a statement, for example, a lot of statements where Prabhupada was talking about women are less intelligent, he's usually unpacking a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam that's talking about Varnashram Dharma. For example, in the first chapter of Geeta, when Arjuna is making his argument about the destruction of the dynasty, you will find in those purports there's some discussion about women being less intelligent. So that has a cultural context, a culture of Varnashram, which we obviously don't live in anymore. So that's going to determine how you interpret something. So that's one point. Context has to be taken into consideration. The other thing that happens is that Prabhupada, well, I didn't mention this in my presentation. I have it in my notes. I can't believe I forgot. There's like essential and peripheral subject matter in scripture. So the essential topics are those that are eternal, and the peripheral topics are those that are temporary, or they're manifest in the psychophysical dimension. Things like sexuality and gender and roles and all these things. They're part of the psychophysical dimension. So there are peripheral topics. And the essential topics are the eternal ones, like soul, God, bhakti, paramatma, and these sorts of things. So when dealing with peripheral issues, because they're part of the psychophysical dimension, they shift around quite a bit. So because of that shifting around, then a lot of interpretation is definitely going to take place because of that. Because they're not eternal truths. For example, again, same example, all women are less intelligent. Well, who's going to come out and say that? All women are less intelligent than all men. Really? Now, I don't know about you, but if any of y'all met Mother Donna Kaylee, I'm like way stupider than her. So even that one defect, you know, that one example would show that statement to be untrue. So no one's going to really come out and say that all women are. And also, when you see that men and women get the same education, they get the same sort of training, there's a lot of things that are shifting around that's going to change the way the culture is. So that's going to leave an interpretation. When you're looking at Prabhupada's statements, what I don't always appreciate is that people don't always take the context into consideration. And they just try to speak to the sensitivity of the modern context instead of just representing honestly like, well, hey, this is what this means, and it has this particular context. And this might be problematized in the modern context because of X, Y, and Z reasons, which you may have like a very valid point. But you don't have to, I don't think you have to edit or necessarily interpret difficult things in a different way if you give people the full context for why that reasoning is coming like that. Also, there was, of course, in just using the same example, Prabhupada had scientific information, at least it was considered scientific at one point, that women's brains were smaller. And Prabhupada used to take that as a sort of evidence for less intelligence. He's mentioned in a few places. And that was based on some scientific information that was, I guess, later on debunked. One other factor to consider. First of all, by the way, this scriptural interpretation there's like a whole field of study in theology called exegesis. And the word exegesis means scriptural interpretation. It's like a big subject matter. So it's not a small thing. I'm giving like just some tidbits here, but it's actually a huge topic. Paramount Sandarbha Jiva Goswami, a whole huge section of Paramount Sandarbha is dedicated to interpretation. So it's a huge subject matter. So I'm just giving some tidbits here. One other thing when it comes to understanding the Acharya's words is that you have to see what previous Acharyas are also saying on the same subject matter, if at all. And then you have to kind of line up. If there's like a consistency of thought throughout the tradition, you can understand that this is what it is. And this is how the tradition views that particular subject matter. But again, when it comes to social issues, you're not going to see much from other Acharyas because they kind of only focused on the eternal principles. They didn't really care about the more peripheral ones as we tend to be preoccupied with in the modern world. But in any case, in general, as a general rule, you want to see what the other thinkers, the other Munis in the mind are thinking on that particular subject matter. And that way you can make out what might be a more appropriate interpretation. Anyway, I did the best I could. These are just some tidbits. It's actually a huge topic. What much can be said. Maybe I have to just give a whole bunch of seminars on all these questions that you guys are asking.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of questions that came in. So we might do a part 2. We've been having this problem with like pretty much every seminar. It like slowly gets going and then the questions exponentially grow.
Okay.
But yeah, we can do one last one, I think, for today.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just gonna try to see which one. Okay, so we have one over here. It says, do we have to take everything that Srila Prabhupada and our Acharyas say as gospel? For example, moon landings, vaccinations, Hitler, etc. How do we reconcile modern scientific evidence with his words? So like the follow-up or in other words is it ever okay to cherry pick?
Yes. Again, going back to my point to Mukunda, there are essential and peripheral subject matters. So you can find this, I'm using this language, but you can find this language used in Bhagavad Gita chapter 2, verse 16. There's sat and asat topics. So the sat are the eternal topics, and the asat topics are the peripheral ones. They have no endurance. They relate to the psychophysical dimension in this material world. So like I said, the psychophysical dimension is shifting around a lot. So things change, perspectives change, understandings may change, and so on. So when it comes to the eternal truths, that is generally what we accept as gospel. And that's the gospel that the Acharyas generally speak. I have to mention, Prabhupada is one of the only Acharyas that has a lot of social commentary. If you study the other books of the Acharyas, they have zero social commentary. Like they don't care. And they were under like strict Islamic rule. You don't hear them talking to people about it. Like they like didn't care. They were just interested in the eternal truths related to Krishna. But Prabhupada, because he wanted a cultural revolution, he also tends to speak a lot about these social issues. So, so when it comes to the more peripheral issues, you gave examples for moon landing or things that are mentioned in scientific circles and so on. You might consider cherry picking or saying like, okay, he didn't have absolute understanding of that in that category. Now, having said that, I would like to also bring up the fact that a lot of the things that are understood as scientific truths are also truths that we've never investigated. I personally don't believe in a moon landing. Now, I didn't believe in it initially because Prabhupada said, so that was good enough for me. But later on, when I started to do my own investigation and asking my own questions, there was just a lot of shit that didn't line up. A lot of questions that aren't answered. And that was after doing my own personal investigation. You know, I'm looking at things in NASA, I'm looking at things, and I'm like, wait a minute, did these guys really go to the moon? Someone lying, or something going on fishy here. So, for example, when it comes to things like, again, I had mentioned earlier on the topic that I have developed some interest in flat Earth because it appears that the Puranas give a flat Earth model. And by flat Earth, you just mean a landscape that stretches out on a horizontal plane, not that there aren't hills and valleys and so on. So that's a huge clash of worldviews, by the way, if that's the case, like a huge one, a globe versus a flat plane. And so I started looking up things about that. And there's a lot of questions that are like mysterious when you do your own investigation. And so I like to say that even when it comes to peripheral topics, Prabhupada may have had a point. I personally, to be honest with you, when I was reading Prabhupada's books, I always accepted all of his social commentary is true. But I never cared to really investigate it, nor did I care to argue in favor of it because it wasn't the essential part. The essential part is bhakti and all that. About 5 years ago, after I left Chicago, one sannyasi gave me a video, a movie, I think it was called The Red Pill or something. And it was about a feminist who went inside the man's, I forget what it was called, like some man movement that was purportedly misogynistic and woman hating and so on. And she did this video about them, and she ended up going from a man's right activist, MRAs, I think that's what they're called. She ended up by the end of the movie going from feminism to being a man's right activist. And after she was at one point, she was like kind of a respected documentarian in the community. And after this movie, she got shunned completely from that community because she didn't fit a certain narrative. So after watching that movie, it opened me up to the idea that Prabhupada may have had a point because he has a lot of anti-feminist sort of rhetoric in his books, which I never, like I said, I just took it for granted it was true without really caring to investigate it. After I saw this video, I was like, well, you know what? There might be some logic to this. And then when I started exploring the logic by why someone might come to that conclusion, I was like, you know, that kind of makes sense. I don't think it might work fully in the modern context, but the logic that can bring someone to that conclusion is not altogether crazy. You know, and maybe it wasn't applied right or something, but the logic is not altogether nonsensical. And so then after that movie, the reason I'm bringing this up, after that movie, it made me start to investigate all of Prabhupada's views on social issues. And then I started to see like, wow, actually Prabhupada's got a point. It may not be a point that's applicable in the modern age, or it may need to be tweaked because of modern circumstances. But it's not that he's just coming from a completely crazy space. Or if he is, my question to you is that, the person who's asking this question, are your scientific truths that you seem to confidently express as truth, how many of those truths have you really investigated for yourself? Now, I can't say, but you can be honest with yourself. In any case, you know whether you want to be honest with yourself or not. How many of those things have you truly investigated? Have you looked into the Pramanas? Have you understand all the paradigms at play? And honestly, maybe some of the motivations at play. Because to be real with you, once this thing starts coming in, that changes. That's a game changer. When you go for, I have many scientist friends, quite a few of them. And they tell me all the time how much cheating goes on in their field because of money. Like, so that doesn't mean all scientists are cheating. But it does mean if someone's going to offer you a lot of money, you know, I think there's been documentaries on this, how corporations paying off certain scientists not to tell about the effect of meat eating, for example. There's been documentaries about all these things. This thing, I think y'all can see my hands, right? Sweeter than honey. That's what the bottom says. Money is sweeter than honey, brighter than sunshine. It's a game changer. And I know we like to think, I remember I saw this from a particular friend. He was expressing his frustration with this whole COVID thing. He was expressing his frustration about why people don't accept science. And then he mentioned in his post, this particular friend I have like utmost respect for. He's incredible. Young guy, super just together. And I kind of look up to him, even though he's younger than me, so it's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, an incredible individual in his own right. But in his post, he had mentioned how science doesn't care about money. They only care about like the facts and figures. And I was like, ooh, child, I don't know. That sounds a little bit credulous. That sounds just a little bit credulous in the modern world. Maybe I mentioned this already in my talk earlier. In an older world, they did seem to really care about like truth, even if they came to some really weird conclusion. They like kind of followed it through. But in the modern world, it speaks loudly. I did a painting. Maybe I can show it on my screen really quick. Yeah, I want to share this with you guys on my screen. Give me two. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I enabled the settings, so you should be able to just hit the share screen button.
Let me show y'all a picture real quick. I think this picture nicely articulates my own personal frustration with what's been going on in the modern situation. All right, share screen. No, this one. Okay. Yeah, boy, look at this picture. This is a money tree, so you can see the dollar bills at the top. And these are the so-called purveyors of truth, scientists, philosophers, academics, religious people even. And if you can see, I'm going to zoom in here. So you can see their mouths are zipped, and inside the cage of their heart it says truth. They're not speaking the truth because of the almighty dollar bill. And if you don't think that plays a huge role in the industry, then you might be suffering from credulity also. Maybe not, but you might be. So the reason I bring that up is to say that these so-called authorities, they have the modern scientific ones and academics and so on, they have really bad character. A lot of them do, because you don't need character to be good in the academy. And some of their work may need a little bit of further investigation. That's all I'm saying. So before we go off and just dismiss Prabhupada or cherry pick, well, he didn't know about this, he didn't know about that. My question to you is, do you know about that? Or is that just something that you received when you were too young to critically think for yourself? And now it's just been programmed into your psyche, so much so that you take it for granted without ever suspecting that it might not even be the truth. That's a question you have to ask for yourself. And I think it's a very good one. I'm certainly dealing with that personally right now. So I'm speaking from personal experience.
Thank you so much, Jaya Jagannath.
I did the best I could. I hope it was
that was great.
Enough.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was actually like a couple more questions, but maybe like if anyone wants to send it to Jaya Jagannath Prabhu, we'll have a slide with his Instagram. It's Urban Sage Deliberates. But you can message him with those questions as well. Other than that, we'll have a couple announcements as usual, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Okay, should I say for that part?
Up to you, bro. Yeah, it'll be like a quick minute, so.
Hi, so just a quick announcement. Our next webinar is with Rukmini Potter, Rock and Rikshi on Instagram, and it'll be next Tuesday as usual. You can follow Jaya Jagannath Prabhu on Instagram, Urban Sage Deliberates, and our socials as well. And any like past recordings, newsletters, or announcements that we have will be on our social media and our website. And I think that's it.
Jai.
Yeah, once again, thank you so much, Jaya Jagannath Prabhu, and thank you everyone for attending. And we'll wrap it up here.
Hari Om Tat
Hari
Sat.
Bol.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Ben.
Your company. Hari Hari.